Hey, once again, MBA hopefuls, welcome to MBA Waves. You're on the air. My name is Eric Lucrezia, as always, hosting with Barra Sabir. How you doing, Barra?
I'm good. How are you? What are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about diversity and inclusion. Specifically, the title is "What About Diversity in the MBA?" As you know, MBA Waves focuses on all things business and education, and we have some great guests with us tonight. But why this topic now? I think it's quite timely because of what's going on in the U.S. Very recently, the U.S. Supreme Court was examining a decision made in the 70s by a U.S. Supreme, well, by the Supreme Court back then, which had to do with affirmative action, and specifically how that relates to education and the admissions process. Harvard was very much under the microscope back then, as they are again right now, in terms of this policy. For those of you who might not know what affirmative action is, this is a policy put in place in attempt to correct some of the wrongs done in the past, right? As you all know, there's a dark history in the US that kind of continues on today. And this is an attempt to correct that thing. So this change that right now is happening is very much due to the balance of power in the Supreme Court these days that was set up by the Trump administration. And a group known as Students for Fair Admission are very much looking at this as a way to shift back to having race not a criteria for admissions decisions. The way it currently is it can be part of it. It is not the main criteria, of course. But of course, diversity and inclusion goes much more beyond race. There's religion, there's political affiliation, there's gender identity. And also when we talk about diversity in terms of MBA admission, we're looking at career sector, like what kind of industry you work in. It's not as much about you, but it's also other things like leadership style, communication, and so forth. So without further ado, I want to introduce some of our guests. First of all, we have a regular on MBA Waves, Kritika Srinivasan, who's also an admissions consultant. Hi, Kritika.
Hi, nice to be here.
Very excited to hear your perspective coming from India in this topic. And our first time on the show on MBA Waves is Gina Cox. Hi, Gina.
Oh, it's really great to be here, and I look forward to a spirited conversation.
And Gina is certainly an expert in diversity and inclusion, and I did manage to pop a copy of your book in the top corner there. Do you want to tell the folks about the book that you've recently published?
Oh, thank you so much for that chance. Yeah, so my book is called Leading Inclusion, and I wrote this book, which just came out in October of this year, so it's just maybe about a month old, for business leaders to help them understand how they could drive inclusion and the conversation and action about inclusion from the top of their organizations. Because without that kind of leadership, what we tend to see is that they're, sort of 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. And basically at the end of a year or any reasonable period of time, we see very little progress.
Absolutely. And so maybe we can ask you, why is the focus on inclusion so important? Like, what should students and why should students and universities care about?
Well, I'm very biased in the sense that I would say we should all care about inclusion. And because, really the whole idea is that humans vary, right? And human variation is normal. I don't even use the word difference when I talk about people, because different than what? We are all in the same boat. We're all humans. And so this natural human variation is something that we tend to not value. And so, I have butterflies on the cover of my book to make the point that when we see butterflies and all their various manifestations, the different colors and sizes, we don't say, oh my gosh, that butterfly is ugly, or that butterfly doesn't deserve to be there. We just say these are butterflies and they come in all variations and we love them all. And I would love for us to feel that way about humans. So the basic idea is that, of course. But from a more practical perspective, I think when we're thinking about the workplace, universities, and those who are being prepared to lead other people, the reality is that the world itself is becoming more diverse. We will more likely encounter people who don't look like us more often. And even if we don't encounter them, what we notice is that the conversations about all the different ways that people vary by race, ethnicity, religion, gender, neurodiversity, LGBTQ plus status, or whatever, religion, for example, we know instinctively that we don't all agree on the same things. We may not look alike, but we still have that humanity at the core. But if you're going to be on a university campus, and if ultimately you're going to be leading other people, it really makes sense for you to consider the benefit of understanding these variations at the very least, just to acknowledge that they are variations, but with that humanity at the core, and then sort of incorporate that in the way that you show up in the world, because that enhances the likelihood that when you do interact with other people, your experiences will be positive. And the last thing I'll say about that, of course, is that one of the shifts that's taking place in this disrupted world is that we see the younger members of our workforce, those entering the workforce. We like to say Gen Z, and that's a bit of a stereotypical idea, but let's just say that our younger employee workforce really have very specific ideas about this issue, which is to say their expectations based on what they say to leaders and how they sort of require that leaders treat their colleagues is that they say, you know what, we're all the same. We should be treated the same. And their expectation is that leaders and the people around them, whether on a campus or in a business, will understand that that's just a fundamental human right.
Absolutely. But, I wanted to ask just a very basic question, because you hear diversity and inclusion a lot these days. It's become a buzzword. And at some point, I think people start to turn off to what they hear all the time. So maybe it's worth kind of defining the two and how they interplay with each other, just to set the base for the conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great idea. So, there are many different ways that these two terms are defined, but you can go even to the academic literature to find very formal definitions. But the definitions that I use, when I say diversity, when I use that word, I'm primarily talking about representation. So, for example, if we're thinking about an available workforce in any one location, let's say here in the United States, because that's convenient for me to say, we know that there are certain characteristics of that workforce. For example, we know that there's about 13% of the population is African American. Let's just use that as an example because it's very concrete. That means that when we look at workforce data, we would expect that generally speaking, an organization might have approximately 13% of its population that would be African American in general. This is a generalization because we know that that is available in the overall workforce. But there could be reasons why they don't have that. And there might even be reasons why they have a higher proportion than that in certain jobs or in certain geographies. But that's an issue of representation. The inclusion, on the other hand, is really about the day-to-day experience of people who vary. In other words, that every employee in an organization have a similar experience and that their experiences don't vary, aren't worse, for example, just because, for example, they come from a certain group or have certain characteristics or believe certain things. So inclusion is about the experience. And I like to think about it in the sense that, as organizations think about these issues, they need to understand these two ideas because they tend to focus more on the diversity thing, the representation thing. But if you bring people into an organization who are more diverse, which is a good thing, and you get a point for that, right? It's a good thing, not a bad thing. But you have a culture in the organization, whether it's a university or a workplace, where those individuals feel like they've come to a dinner party, and they're the 11th guests, but the table is only set for 10. They come in with all of these high hopes, but they figure out where's my plate, where's my cup, where's my spoon. So inclusion is also about the idea over and above diversity of making sure that the environment is such that everybody can feel like there's a place for them.
Yeah, I guess feeling like you have that access does open the door for you to take those chances, take risks, and maybe take a degree, for example. Kritika, did you have a comment, or did you want to share something from your perspective over? You're in Bangalore, right?
Yes, I'm in Bangalore. And I have to tell you that, this part of the world, diversity typically means having representation for the various genders because there's such a huge gender bias and other things. And one of the things that I was reading upon recently was about the AI bias that typically exists and how automated interviews are a way of bringing more people in. I'm curious now to say what do you think are some hallmarks of a leader who does inclusion right?
Mhm. Well, when I think about the outcome measures of inclusion, I think of them as being seen, being heard, and being valued. And being seen, like it's, the word, as the word implies, is basically about just being there, being in the situation, being allowed to be in the situation. Being heard is about having opportunities to express your point of view, express your ideas, and maybe have those ideas be heard and be influential rather, and not just, sort of subordinated or not heard or pushed to the back. And then being, the last piece, being valued, has a lot of manifestations. It could have, being promoted, being trained, being given access to jobs that have high visibility, where you have, political clout. And of course, it could also mean being paid equitably, and being recognized for the contributions that you make, not just in terms of money, but getting, people saying thank you, giving you a pat on the back, letting other people know that you've done something fantastic. All of the things that I just mentioned are behavioral examples of what inclusion looks like and what it feels like. And so when leaders say, well, what does it look like? They might think this is something esoteric or abstract. But I specifically gave you behavioral examples to say, you know what? It comes down to individual leader behavior and the specific decisions they make in every moment. So I do just encourage leaders, when they think about this, and anyone really, when they think about inclusion, to think about, do you believe that all the people around you, especially if you have a leadership role, are they having equal opportunity to be seen, to be heard, and to feel valued? And when they think about the examples of that in their own world, they usually can come up with, what would make sense.
It sounds like a really important thing when students are checking out programs, right? That they should actually observe what's actually happening when they go into the classroom and when they look at just how the schools are set up. And who's in leadership and how they are leading. That's something we haven't talked too much about, but I would imagine that because it's a lot of things that aren't said or spoken but observed, right? It's things that when you go into the classroom, you'll see how.
Yeah. Absolutely. One of the stories that I always think about, it's just so clear in my mind as a memory, is I remember when I was in school and I had come from another country and I had kind of learned the rules of the road along the way and so on. But I remember when it came time for internships, I didn't know how that worked. I had no idea. I hadn't thought about it. I just knew I needed to have an internship. And then I kept noticing my colleagues would say, oh, I'm going to work. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do, these were really fascinating things. So I went to the internship coordinator and I said, well, I need an internship. And the internship that they offered me was to work as an administrative assistant at a Burger King. And not to say that there's anything wrong with that, but I was in a master's degree program and I thought, well, why did those folks get those opportunities? And I went and found and created my own internships. It's related to the question you ask, in the sense that all of us, both those who are the students as well as those who have the opportunity to share these resources, ought to think carefully about how those opportunities are distributed and to whom, because everybody who needs an internship should have access to the same internships. It shouldn't be, oh, that person got it first and the other person heard about the special one. But that kind of stuff happens quite a bit. And then the other piece, of course, is that had I taken the internship that had been offered to me, I would have been in a situation where I wouldn't have been prepared as well as my colleagues, because the opportunity was a less than opportunity. So I created my own internships by developing relationships in 2 companies, and that made a significant positive difference for me.
I'm thinking also what you're saying, what you said before, it reminds me, I lived in Jerusalem for 2 years. And when I went as a student, but an independent student. I felt like I had entered a world that was 20 years earlier than the US. And there were so many assumptions about being a woman there that certainly it wasn't about being Jewish, because everyone there was Jewish. It was the first time I was in a singular butterfly color there, right? Yes. And yet all of a sudden I was confronted with certain expectations of me as a woman that I hadn't even considered before, that were 20 years earlier, that I had just grown up assuming. And it was a rude awakening, frankly, to be in a position where I felt like I was not equal with the people around me at all. And it also made me realize that women in the United States are still not equal. We're not getting equal pay. So even though I had a certain level of assumption, I went to another place and then I was able to look back and see it differently. It was a very interesting experience. And what you're saying about, giving students the experience of diversity gives them what if they go to a different planet and they're meeting different aliens?
Yes,
Have the tools to
right.
consider and the questions to ask and the open-heartedness when
Yes.
you see people who are just like you or aliens that might like, where's the point of connection going to be,
Yeah,
right?
I agree. Yeah. And I would love to hear Kavitha's point of view, but I will just say one thing, and that is the reality is this is what humans do wherever they are in the world. To your point, humans, we tend to try to find what's similar and we gravitate towards what's similar and we tend to step back from what's different. And this is just what we do as humans. All of us do it, right? So even that mindset and that awareness, I think, helps us to realize that it could show up in different forms in different places, but there's always something that we can do as individuals to kind of make it better if we are aware and notice that this is what's happening. Kavitha, did you want to add? I think you wanted to say something.
Right. So, I want to say that, in this interesting discussion, I was like, yes. In the interesting discussion, right? Like, we were able to see, especially in business schools, release a lot of essays around like how students would have included, how students were inclusive and how they had embraced diversity in their previous roles before. So that was something that was very interesting, and this was something that we saw, especially in the last, I would say, 5 years and more. But they were like, in undergraduate, I'm sure that there was the diversity factor or the diversity essay, which was always there. And what was interesting for me was it was always tied to more of economic backgrounds, your socio-political situations before. And then later on, it shifted towards more of gender, LGBTQIA plus, and so on. So that shift I thought was very interesting, especially when it came to inclusion. So one question I had is like, how do you foresee, or what do you foresee are some of the challenges for people to be not as inclusive?
First of all, let me apologize for mispronouncing your name because I could not see. I'm not wearing my eyeglasses, and I kept calling you by the name of a colleague of mine, which is a really bad thing to do. So I apologize for that, Krithika. But the whole thing about inclusion, if you think about it in the context of where we are and where we're going as a world, right, is that we can sort of see, we can all sense that this world around us is asking us to think about humans in a different way. We are much more aware because of new world news and the internet about the experiences of people very far away from us geographically. But even if they're far away from us geographically, they're very close to us in the metaverse, in the internet, because this is what the tools, the technology tools that we have made possible. So we're actually quite close to one another. That means that if we're closer than ever to one another, we're interacting with people with all these variations. It certainly makes sense for us to be adept at interacting with those people. But in particular, if you're running an enterprise, what I say to leaders now is that not only do Gen Zers expect that leaders will be inclusive, what also seems to be happening based on what I'm observing from my research is that clients and customers are also asking for the same thing. Clients and customers are asking, they're asking business people, whether they're running a school or running a manufacturing facility, do you know who your customers are? Do you have a diverse customer base? And if you do you understand their experiences well enough that you can design your products and services in a way that will satisfy all of those people? Are you even attempting to distribute your products and goods and services to a wide range of people? Or are you still operating in a very narrow way where you think, for example, that, I like to use the example of the plaster that you put on your skin when you have a wound. And, my skin color has always been this, but forever it has been sort of that pink color. And we've just accepted the fact that people call it flesh tone. And yet everybody's flesh is not that color. That's an example, for example, where, when people are asking, the manufacturers of products different questions about inclusion. So ultimately what will happen is that organizations that pay more attention to these issues are going to get a larger share of the clients of the market for whatever it is that they do. And those who do not will find themselves in what I call an inclusion deficit. they will have to try to keep up with the organizations that are ahead of them in attending to these issues. And by the way, across the world, there are a lot of companies that are paying attention to these issues. Although, of course, we tend to talk more about the ones that are not, but they are companies that are doing things right. And then there are companies that have to catch up with them, and they're going to lose out ultimately if they don't.
I think that's a really great point, and it also speaks to like what schools are paying attention to these issues, and who at the school is paying attention to these issues. And I'm curious what you think MBA students should focus on in their studies to thrive in a disrupted world, and do they need to think differently than the students that came before them?
Yeah. I certainly do think there's an opportunity here. I spent a lot of time myself as a student at universities, and there tends to be a very sort of clearly defined idea of what people should study, how they should behave, how they should dress. There's sort of the rules, right? And so as you go through your curricula, we all know if you're in an MBA program, for example, you will study marketing, you will study finance, you will study operations research, you will study, sales and all of those traditional functions. But one of the things that I have always felt was was sort of underemphasized was the human in the whole enterprise. So all the stuff that had to do with the organizational behavior and dynamics tended to be put into the category of soft skills. In fact, you would hear faculty, and still do, hear them use the words soft skills. And so what they're basically suggesting, I think, is that these other things, the marketing, the sales, the finance, are more important and hard. And these things over here, the human experiences, are less important and soft. And I think that whole idea, which is the standard operating procedure for business schools, is one that has to change. But in the meantime, especially until they change, I think MBA students have got to focus more themselves when they take their electives and choose the ways that they want to focus their curricula. They've got to think about what can they learn while they're in school that is going to help them deal with a more diverse workforce. And so they should be paying attention to issues such as diversity and inclusion, of course, but they also need to be thinking about things like understanding mental health. They need to really be thinking about what is going on in the world that they're going to then be a part of in a leadership role, and not just stick to the traditional curricula. And one very specific competency I will call out is curiosity, because it is falling out at the top of the list on many of the thought leadership research that is being done across the world about the one characteristic that is valued in the C-suite. And so curiosity is something that they should work on developing while they're there.
Interesting the take you have on the hard skills versus soft skills. Indeed, it's the soft skills, or as I'm starting to hear more and more schools and industry professionals talk about, they call it human skills rather than soft skills, to emphasize that it's not something soft. But I always took it as like, in terms of computers, you need the hardware and the software. One is not more valuable than the other. Yeah, it's clear that the benefits of diversity in the workplace have yielded better results, right? Study after study has proven that companies benefit on an interpersonal level, but also on a revenue level from diversity. And it seems to me from this conversation that inclusion is one of the best ways to get there, right? And it has to come from the top down, as you say. And since universities and business schools, MBA programs sort of follow the lead of companies, they have definitely made diversity a prime. It's one of their biggest values. It's one of the things they target in terms of having a diverse class in all of the ways I talked about at the beginning of the episode. And one of the proofs of that is the diversity scholarships, right? So many business schools offer pretty generous scholarships based on various elements of diversity. And so I wanted to come back to like some of the points you had mentioned earlier, like, like in terms of people who are applying for business school right now, like what advice would you give someone who's in the early stages of preparing themselves for a leadership role in business, and using an MBA to get there as that diversity?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the number one thing anybody who's going into, at this early stages of their career, the number one thing I really encourage is a greater sense of self-empowerment, meaning don't go into the program thinking the program is going to tell you who you will be or what you should do. Go into any program, regardless of what it is, saying, what is it that you think your career strategy is? What is your vision for who you want to be 5 years from now. And I know 5 years is a long time and a lot will change, but you always have to do that, because if you don't do that, the first class that you take is going to be a class somebody else told you to take. And the very last class you take is going to be something that somebody told you to take. And you won't know why you did it. And at the graduation, you won't know, well, what did I really learn? Because it won't be in service of you transforming the world. So the biggest piece of advice I give is to think about your academic career as a stepping stone to your working career, and think of the career strategy about what is it that you want at the end of that? How do you want to make the world better? When you do that, it then makes it easier for you to make choices about what you will take, especially when you have when you have the option to decide. And additionally, I would say that the important thing is that you'll have to take that same attitude after you graduate. You have to think about your career as a portfolio of skills, of competencies, of behaviors, and so on that you master. And don't just think of it as, oh, I have an MBA, so now I do this. You have to have a plan.
Indeed, absolutely. Earlier we were speaking about affirmative action in the U.S. And I don't want the conversation to be too U.S. centric. We have people in the audience from all over the world. And indeed, the translation for affirmative action in French, since I live in Paris, I can speak a bit about France, is discrimination positive, which literally translates to positive discrimination, which immediately, even though the word positive is there, it has a negative connotation because discrimination is in it. And it is indeed illegal in France. They just, bar none, do not have affirmative action here. And there's a question that came in from someone named Joshua Smith, who asks regarding higher education. He mentions that in France, he's seen up to 60% of more teachers adjunct in programs, and program directors appear to move on after 3 years. So how could universities prioritize diversity with so many moving pieces?
So I think what the person is saying is, how do you keep a diverse workforce when people are moving around? I think that the same thing applies in any kind of work situation. This has to be something that you think about very purposefully when you are leading an enterprise, whether it's a school or something else. This has to be something that matters and that you say you want to do. Now, that means that you have to anticipate that there will always be a certain amount of turnover. And therefore, in your recruiting efforts, you're trying to find a diverse representation that comes in, to start these jobs. And every time you have to hire, you have to think about this. How do you maximize your diversity? But obviously, there isn't anything that you can do to necessarily stop people from leaving once they join an organization, other than, of course, when you have those people in your organization, make sure that you are providing an inclusive work environment that will make them want to stay. So we didn't discuss it in that question, but one of the things about that question that I would want to know is, well, what is it that is causing these people to leave? And there obviously is something, right? Is it just that they're getting more money somewhere else, or is it something even deeper than that? So I do think, in addition to really focusing on, diversity and representation constantly, you also have to think about inclusion, because inclusion is usually the variable that accounts for why people do not stay. People say they don't stay because they have certain experiences that made them feel excluded.
Yeah, Josh, if you have any follow-up to that, you're welcome to type in a final question. Kritika, did you have anything to add at this point?
I really like this point because, especially in India, where you have a lot of startups and other companies, which I know of and of course part of, I see this happening a lot because certain people feel that even though they might get representation, they don't get the voice. And today I got this great definition of inclusion, saying that you want to be heard, seen, and be valued. And I feel that is probably the reason why people are not going to stick around. If your ideas are not being respected, if you whatever you have to offer is again not being valued, and of course you're not being seen as somebody of value and of course worthy of respect, then you're not going to be you have no reason to stay. So while I feel that, yes, while people might move for money and others, that might be a secondary reasons, and often the jump will definitely happen when they're not as heard. So yeah, that was a great point, and it happens in a lot of companies too.
It does. I mean, most studies seem to show that money is not the primary driving factor of why people stay at their company. There's so many other factors and other motivators that speak greater. You know, having purpose, I think, is really one of those central things. And I think inclusion helps to create that fertile ground for finding that purpose.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Eric. And one of the things that I wrote about after doing some research is that I'd like to go back to the core idea of respect, because all of these ideas, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, they're very abstract, and I don't think employees use those words in our day-to-day lives when we talk about our experiences. On the other hand, respect as an outcome is something that everybody understands. And so if you ask employees, do you feel respected? They can tell you yes. And if they say no, they can also tell you, why they don't feel respected. And if you say, tell me what it would take in this environment for you to feel respected, they can tell you. So one of the things that I'm really pushing people to think a little bit about is to get away from all of these abstract ideas and put respect first. Because whether it's, Kavitha talking about Chris, I can't see it, so I'm apologizing again. Regardless of where you are in the world, and regardless of how you're talking about differences, you are going to see differences. And if you talk to people, what you quickly discover is that the thing they identify as the defining factor is whether they feel respected or not. And so I did want to just leave that idea that this core old-fashioned idea of respect, which is somewhat related to civility and somewhat related to empathy, all of these things are somewhat related to one another. That's really at the core of what we're talking about. If you could see yourself in somebody else's shoes, and if you could see that you would want to be treated a certain way and you can treat that person that way, you're more likely to create an environment where students, faculty, and everybody else would stay.
Thanks, Gina, for tying that in there, because I think that makes it relatable to a lot of people. For a lot of younger generations, Gen Z, millennials can easily relate to that. Diversity, inclusion seems natural and normal, whereas sometimes older generations, that may seem a little bit fluffy. Some of the more traditional industries or older companies, more established companies, might find it just a little bit fluff. But tying it back to something that we all know that goes back to many generations is the concept of respect. And so if you put it that way, I think it concretizes the concept a bit more and makes it more easily to apply. I know that we have to wrap up pretty much now. So I wanted to thank all of you for this conversation. We could probably do a week-long conference about diversity and inclusion as it relates to MBAs, but we are limited to 30 minutes today. So thank you so much to everyone who's been on. Gina, it was great to meet you. Kritika, always great to see you on the show. Bara, you're my girl. And see you next week on MBA Waves. We'll be talking with WHU and their alums. So see you at the same time, same channel, MBAwaves.com. Bye-bye.